After the 1-2 punch of the NES Zelda games, Nintendo's design team was faced with a difficult choice. The immense success of both titles demanded a continued future for the franchise, but in which direction should Zelda head? Despite releasing within a year of each other on the same hardware, Zelda 1 and 2 are vastly different games. Some fledgling YouTuber made a pair of analysis videos on them last year, and I thought that those were pretty good. I think his name was Austin or something. You can absolutely enjoy this video without having seen those prior ones in my series, but it can only enhance your perspective as we continue to make our way through the franchise, so I'd encourage you to give them a watch. Anyway, a hypothetical Zelda 3 could continue to push the staggeringly open exploration that defined the original title, or could lean into the more trendy side-scrolling action RPG style of the most recent release. There would have been merits to either path, but there's actually a third, even more ambitious option: designing something fresh. With a franchise as prolific as Zelda, it's always interesting to look back at its history with special attention paid to the critical turning points. The Legend of Zelda series is 35 years old as of this video's recording. In order to remain relevant over that entire time span, it is essential that a franchise be willing to reinvent itself at these critical points. The first age of the franchise was categorized by experimentation with different ideas and styles. It was frequently sloppy and unpolished, but possessed a plethora of great ideas and innovations that I can't help but respect even from a modern vantage point. Despite these breakthroughs, it would surprise me if the series could have sustained itself if it continued in this path of experimentation. Some degree of stability was required. The developers needed to take what worked and establish what it meant to be a Zelda game moving forward if they wanted to ensure the future of the series. Nintendo ultimately did just that and designed something entirely new that both honored what came before it while also laying the groundwork for the franchise future. We know it as The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. Even someone with a cursory knowledge of the franchise can tell you that A Link to the Past took a large amount of inspiration from the original. I mean, you can see the similarities just from a screenshot comparison. Of course, it has to be said that Link to the Past has aged far more gracefully than its NES forebearers. That new 16-bit SNES really was something, and Link to the Past expertly took advantage of its power. Nevertheless, anyone can see that the two games were cut from the same cloth. Link to the Past retains the top-down perspective, the split between overworld and dungeons, the use of items in combat and puzzle solving, and many other surface-level elements. It's less obvious what was changed, but I'd like to argue that Link to the Past deviates from its predecessor in enough significant ways that it marks the first inflection point for the franchise. I think it would be helpful to begin the discussion with Link to the Past's basic story and structure. Other than a brief optional opening movie to set the scene, the game begins in medias res, in the middle of the action. A perplexingly pink-haired Link wakes up on a rainy night after a mysterious dream and trails his uncle to the nearby castle to investigate this strange occurrence. Once again, this sequence really shows off the Super Nintendo's power at creating atmosphere. Something like this could never be accomplished this effectively on older hardware. The opening is definitely a memorable way to start the game, but you can already see that Link to the Past operates under a different design philosophy from the original Legend of Zelda. That game famously hands the reins to the player from the very first second, and immediately presents multiple paths to begin exploring. Compare that to Link to the Past. It doesn't take long before the player is allowed to control Link, but you aren't given any freedom until the entire sequence is completed. The game does its best to disguise the impression that you are being pushed along a gated path to the castle, but it can't hide the fact that there is no opportunities to deviate from that designated path. Even Hyrule Castle, a kind of introductory dungeon, really only has one path through it. The multiple floor levels, outdoor areas, and relative size of the castle obfuscate this linear progression, but with the exception of some directionless wandering, every player will follow essentially the same path through the level. It's important for me to stress that I don't think this is necessarily inferior to a non-linear setup. There are many ways in which I actually prefer it. Those reasons will become clearer throughout this video. After rescuing the imprisoned Princess Zelda and escaping Hyrule Castle through the sewers, the map is finally opened up. This is probably about 20 minutes into the game for a competent player. But even then, you are given a detailed map of the entire overworld with a big marker indicating where you should head. Technically, you are free to head in any direction, but the game makes it clear exactly where you should go. You'll recall that the original Zelda didn't even have a map, let alone waypoints. And what do you find when you arrive at your destination in Kakariko Village? But another location marker that directs you to Sahasrahla, your primary guide throughout the game. He tasks Link with retrieving 3 pendants to prove he is worthy to wield the Blade of Evil's Bane. He also takes the liberty of marking your map with locations of all 3 pendants. These are each housed in a dungeon: the Eastern Palace, the Desert Palace, and the Tower of Hera. More on the dungeons later. These 3 dungeons must be done in the order I listed them. The way the game enforces this is a method I find rewarding: item gates. Entry to the Desert Palace requires the Book of Mudora, which in turn requires the Pegasus Boots to grab it from the library in Kakariko. The Pegasus Boots are given as a reward from Sahasrahla for clearing the Eastern Palace, so you are allowed to get as far as the entrance to the second dungeon, but won't actually be able to enter it until you clear the first. In turn, the Tower of Hera is located in the upper mountainous region of the map, which is blocked off by a large rock that Link can only bypass after obtaining the Power Glove, which is found in the Desert Palace. These item gates are a staple of the series at this point, and I consider them to be the cleanest way to enforce the linear nature of these games. It gives the player a rewarding sense of progression, and doesn't limit their exploration any more than necessary. Along the way, Sahasrahla doles out bits of exposition to fill out the story. At its core, it still boils down to an evil magician, in this case Aghanim, taking over Hyrule, but the extra lore fleshes the story out in a way the previous Zelda games were not. Looking back, it was quite primitive compared to future Zelda stories, but there is still definite growth in that department from the 2 prior games. Once you've obtained all 3 pendants, you are finally able to draw the Master Sword from its pedestal in the Lost Woods. The woods themselves aren't all that hard to navigate, but the anticipation of finally being able to face Aghanim with the sword elevates it. The imitation swords scattered about are a great touch that keeps you focused on the real prize hidden within. When you finally stumble upon a clearing in the woods and lay eyes on the real Master Sword, you are treated to an instantly iconic sequence. This is what I meant when I said that Link to the Past makes the most of its hardware. This scene does so much with so little. The little animals framing the path, the musical motif punctuating the moment, and the way Link holds the pose with the Master Sword over his head as Sahasrahla's message scrolls by, all just make it a magical moment. You don't have long to celebrate, however, as Zelda is once again in danger. You rush to Sanctuary only to find out that she has been taken to Hyrule Castle. Returning to the introductory dungeon at this point in the game really hits home how far Link and the player have come. The layout is identical, but now the player is filled with confidence rather than trepidation. The Master Sword opens the upper floors up for exploration, and after a combat gauntlet up the tower, you can finally face off with Aghanim. The fight is a bit anticlimactic if we're being honest, but the game has a very good reason for this. In a final act of desperation, Aghanim drags Link into the Dark World, a parallel dimension his army has already subjugated. Right when you think the game is wrapping up, Nintendo surprises you with a whole new land with a whopping 7 new dungeons to conquer before you can rematch the villain. Now that's a statement. Here would be the perfect opportunity for the designers to really set the player free to tackle these new challenges in whatever way they see fit. After all, if a player reached this part of the game, they have proven themselves capable of taking the training wheels off. I know when I first reached the Dark World, I was excited to venture out into new uncharted territory, eager to explore without all the hand-holding. And this is what I was greeted with upon opening the map: a conveniently ordered series of waypoints for all of the late game dungeons. To be fair, it is possible to tackle most of these dungeons out of this prescribed order, but that just makes it even more baffling that Nintendo would set an order in the first place. You have to go out of your way to deviate from the intended path. How much cooler would it have been if you didn't even know what the intended path was? Or better yet, if there was no intended path? I could even tolerate the dungeon's locations being marked on the map, but why, oh why, did they have to be numbered? The dungeons of the original game were technically ordered as well, but the number was only revealed upon entering the dungeon, and all the dungeons were hidden for the player to discover on their own. This makes a huge difference. The rest of the game proceeds as you would expect, dungeon after dungeon with some overworld exploration in between. Eventually, once all the dungeons are complete, you get your rematch with Aghanim, with the twist that Ganon is actually the ultimate villain of the game. I apologize if that beat-by-beat breakdown on the game's progression was a bit boring, but I think it will make the rest of the video easier to follow. You need an understanding on how the game is put together to evaluate how well it functions. Almost every Zelda game following Link to the Past has a defining gimmick. I don't use the word gimmick pejoratively, I just mean something that differentiates the game from the rest of the series, a unique quirk of that title in particular. For Link to the Past, this defining element has got to be the Dark World, so let's dig into it. The idea of an alternate world is hinted at earlier in the game, but its full scope isn't revealed until the second set of dungeons is unlocked. The Dark World mirrors the normal Overworld, I guess I'll call it the Light World for clarity, but is twisted in some interesting ways. For example, in place of Hyrule Castle is the Pyramid of Power, a far more sinister centerpiece. The inviting Kakariko Village is no more, and instead you will find the Village of Outcasts, swarming with unsavory characters. The map as a whole is overflowing with new, far more deadly enemy types that force you to proceed with the utmost caution. I know my first moments in the Dark World always require a bit of an adjustment. By the time Link is set free in the Dark World, the player has grown so familiar with the Light World that the slightly off layout and greater danger of the Dark World keeps you on your toes. The best part of the Dark World is that it doesn't replace the Light World. All of the late game dungeons are found in the Dark World, but it's not like the Light World just disappears. You are free to travel back and forth between the two worlds. This dimension hopping is often required for some of the game's smartest puzzles. The way it works is interesting. In the Light World, there are a series of 9 hidden warp points that will transport Link to the corresponding location in the Dark World. These are well distributed throughout the map, so there isn't much wasted time walking to them. They are also a constant reward for map awareness. I know that when I come back to the game after a long break, I sometimes have trouble remembering the best warps and have to settle for a more obvious one that is totally out of the way. I really like this system, but if that was the extent of it, there would be a heavy limit on puzzle potential. Thankfully, while Light World to Dark World travel is accomplished by set warp points, this isn't true for Dark World to Light World travel. Instead, through the use of a magic mirror equipable item, Link can freely jump to the Light World from any point on the Dark World map. This allows players to get creative with their warps to take advantage of the differences in map layouts. Take this example where a heart piece is placed in full view of the player in the Light World. This has been a tease every time they pay Lake Hylia a visit, but no matter what they try, it isn't possible to get on the island. Once the Dark World is revealed, an observant player might think to find the exact spot in the Dark World that lines up with the island, and is rewarded with the heart piece. The mirror even leaves a temporary warp point behind to immediately return to your Dark World exit point. Nice little quality of life feature, as I have no doubts that I would be singing a completely different tune if the game forced me to take the scenic way back to my original location each time. This basic idea is repeated countless times in the game. Some roadblock in the Light World is bypassed by clever Dark World positioning. There's just one downside to this. By allowing the player to warp from anywhere, often their Light World entry point is already occupied by something else. This happens more than you would think because the game is extremely particular when it checks to see if your entry point is valid. If even a pixel is overlapping another object, you are sent right back to the Dark World to reposition and try again. I don't get frustrated when my warp is completely off and I'm able to correct it within 1 or 2 tries. I get frustrated when I'm trying to make an ultra-precise jump and I'm punished over and over by the tiniest overlap. If it was possible to have some tolerance for close enough warps, and just shifted me to the closest allowable space instead of sending me back to the Dark World, I'd be completely satisfied. I don't know if something like this could be done on the SNES. I suspect it could, but probably would take some extra coding on the environment, and its implementation would inevitably kill a lot of the cool out-of-bounds glitches that were widespread back then, which would be a bit of a shame. Nevertheless, giving players greater control over exploration is never a bad idea, and the decision to implement the magic mirror pays off so well throughout the game. I'm willing to forgive these little hitches, even if they can get on my nerves at times. The Overworld, or rather both Overworlds, are a natural progression from that of Zelda 1, but significantly more immersive and natural looking, thanks again to the SNES hardware. This game's version of Hyrule bears many of the same landmarks from the Hyrules of the previous titles, but it's so early in the series that these have yet to grow stale. Your typical Death Mountain, Lost Woods, and generic graveyard are all present and accounted for, but new locations like the Zora domain are added to the mix. The actual act of traversing the map is comparably streamlined now, which is obviously great. There is now some degree of smooth camera scrolling as you move. The jarring camera shifts when Link moves to the edges of the screen still occur at times, but are significantly less frequent. You can speed up movement with the Pegasus boots, albeit only in a straight line. I somehow seem to waste more time than I save by constantly bumping into walls with these, but they're a blast to use and can definitely cut down on travel time. Link to the Past's fast travel system is actually useful, unlike the one found in Zelda 1, assuming you figure out how to enable it with the Ocarina. Zelda 2 made an effort to make Hyrule feel more lived in with the addition of towns, but Link to the Past goes well beyond it in making its world feel organically populated. There's only one real town, Kakariko Village, but you'll find a wealth of helpful characters out and about on your travels. A fortune teller who will offer you hints, for a price. A couple of Hylian boys transformed by the Dark World's magic. Kiki the monkey, who assists Link in navigating a tricky maze. The mysterious Mad Batter, who upon being freed will curse Link with reduced magic consumption. And who could forget the fairy mainstays, always good for a full heal. And new to this game, fairies or potions can be held in bottles for when they are most needed. The key improvement Link to the Past made in this realm is evolving the NPCs from faceless copy and paste entities to individuals who serve a purpose in the world. That purpose could be as simple as a humorous line, but that's just fine because a small unique line does wonders in turning that sprite into a character. A very minor character maybe, but still a character. This new version of Hyrule is also far better at implementing secrets into the world. With how carefully directed the main dungeon progression is, you would be forgiven for assuming exploration wasn't adequately rewarded. But in fact, much of the side content is completely left up to the player to discover. This includes a wide collection of situational items and spells that are never required, but handy to have in a pinch, as well as the expected upgrades to your sword, arrows, bombs, etc. The original Zelda reserved 5 life upgrades as the ultimate reward for exploration. Link to the Past has 24 heart pieces, well hidden between 2 worlds. These make for such a great reward when you compare them to a couple of rupees, and it's no surprise that the heart piece system has been recycled in nearly every game since. Crucially, Link to the Past does not continue the tradition of incredibly obscure secrets. The most obvious evidence is the visual change to bombable walls that now telegraphs the spot where a secret might be found. When I draw attention to them like this, I'm sure you are thinking that the change makes the secret too obvious and defeats the entire purpose. But when your mind is busy with actually playing the game, you would be surprised by how easy they are to miss. Even beyond simple bombable walls, Link to the Past does a far better job at hinting at secret optional content than either of its predecessors. Often with Zelda 1 and 2, secrets are only found through intense trial and error, or through word of mouth. Link to the Past also uses word of mouth for its secrets, but the difference is that it is the in-game NPCs teasing hidden content, not that neighbor kid whose uncle works at Nintendo. My favorite part of the Zelda series is the dungeons. I love these self-contained labyrinths that challenge your combat aptitude, navigation ability, and puzzle solving. Dungeons have been a part of the series since the very beginning, but it wasn't until Link to the Past that they really hit their stride and became the highlight of the games. The dungeons of Zelda 1 and 2 were joyless exercises that didn't feel like the handcrafted showcases they would become from this point forward. The basic format of a Link to the Past dungeon is as follows. Once you enter the dungeon, you take a bit of time to get your bearings and check out all of the rooms open to you initially. This will uncover small keys that can be used to open up more of the dungeon that is blocked by locked doors. Eventually you will find a big key, which allows access to the dungeon item. The dungeon item isn't always required to complete the dungeon, but it is always an important acquisition. You can also find helpful navigation aids such as the map or the compass, which reveals the location of the dungeon's boss. You go deeper and deeper into the dungeon until you finally reach this boss and have a climactic face-off. These fights double as a final challenge as well as a spectacular reward for a job well done. Not all of the designs are winners, but it's always exciting to see what lays in wait at the core of the dungeon. A couple of these guys can really put up a fight. I love the sprite work on some of the meteor ones like Helmasaur King. and there are some pretty creative fights, like the one with the Armos Knights. This is the basic format for each Link to the Past dungeon, but also for pretty much every dungeon in the series with minor variations. And it works really well. Even if each dungeon follows the same basic format, there is still a ton of opportunity for variety within this structure. That being said, the dungeons of A Link to the Past sadly aren't nearly as distinct as those from future games. Much of the same visual language is reused between them, and there is only one track of dungeon music used on loop for every single dungeon. That isn't to say the developers didn't make attempts to differentiate each dungeon design even in this game. The first dungeon, the Eastern Palace, is fittingly extremely linear. Compare that to the Labyrinth of Misery Mire, where the player is overwhelmed with different paths. These more non-linear dungeons can be surprisingly small once you realize how few rooms are actually required. They are filled with tons of optional paths to distract you. The Tower of Hera, despite being played in 2D, plays around with dropping from an upper floor to a lower floor. Skull Woods is unique with how it mixes in outdoor sections and multiple entrances. Turtle Rock plays with single-use gimmicks like this moving platform or this maze of pipes. Thieves Town has you escorting a lost girl throughout the dungeon until she reveals herself to actually be the dungeon's boss, Blind. Because Link to the Past is willing to play with dungeon concepts, it surprises me that the dimension warping mechanic is never integrated into them. Feels like missed potential to me. The dungeons are made that much more enjoyable by how great the combat is in this game. I devoted a whole section to how frustrating it was to control Link in my Zelda 1 video, and pretty much everything has been fixed in Link to the Past. Link can now move in 8 directions, which is essential for avoiding enemies and attacks that can flood the screen at times. His primary sword attack is now a swing rather than a thrust, which has a far more reasonable hitbox. Previously, you could only attack a monster if you were right on top of it. Speaking of monsters, there's more enemy variety than ever before, and Link has so many options in combat now. The sword is the staple of his moveset, obviously, and you can rely on it almost exclusively if you so choose. But for those who want to get creative, there is a wealth of gear that can be integrated into the combat. Just look at this inventory. It's almost too much, but you choose how much you engage with the extra items. You've got the return of the bow, bombs, and boomerang. The brand new hookshot is more for grabbing items or pulling Link over pits, but can be used as a stun in combat too. The magic hammer offers a short-range slam that sort of invokes the sword attack of Zelda 1 that I was just complaining about. The magic meter returns from Zelda 2 and fuels a pair of rods, fire and ice. The Cane of Burna summons a protective barrier for Link and turns face tanking into a viable option. The magic cape turns Link invisible as well as invincible and allows him to run through enemies unharmed. Then you have 3 medallions that unleash screen nuking spells. These are admittedly very redundant as they all kind of do the same thing at the end of the day, but they are a blast to activate. All of these new options are best put to use in the boss fights where the challenge ramps up. But even in the more difficult fights, it never feels unfair because the game controls so well. The level of challenge is just right. The way that Nintendo enhanced and refined the combat pays out dividends throughout the entire game, because you never go very long without engaging in a fight. Looking back at Link to the Past today, it can be hard to resist the idea that it has been eclipsed by the games that released after it, and in many ways this is true. The newer games boast larger worlds and more varied dungeons. They universally have more involved stories, home to memorable characters that would put plain old Sahasrara to shame. In that sense, it can feel a little underwhelming to play Link to the Past today. It just feels kind of vanilla now. Honestly, that's the driving motivator for me undertaking this retrospective series and playing through the entire series chronologically. It's given me a far greater idea of the individual contributions each game has had to the legacy of the franchise, and I don't think it's possible to argue that any Zelda game has had a greater impact on the series than that of Link to the Past. This game single-handedly established the entire Zelda formula framework that has been rehashed again and again to universal praise. It wasn't until just recently that the series started to break away from the shadow of Link to the Past. Despite releasing in 1991, this granddaddy still holds up to its descendants in many ways. I'm not saying that the following games didn't come packed with their own smaller advancements and innovations, but essentially they all iterate on Link to the Past, with a fresh coat of paint, more refinements, and different theming and gimmicks. This game deserves recognition not just for its own critical and commercial success, but for the legacy of the entire franchise. It's no small wonder that the Legend of Zelda series has reached such great heights when it stands on the shoulders of a true giant like Link to the Past.